Houston's bayous are a core part of how we live and move through the city. You know them, you love them. You've probably taken a walk along one of them with your dog, or explained to your friends why Houston is nicknamed the Bayou City, but you might not know the full story behind these waterways. They shape our geography, our ecosystems, and even the way we experience Houston's urban environment. Over the years, Houston's bayous have been at the heart of questions ranging from flood control to conservation, from how we preserve biodiversity to how we live sustainably in a rapidly growing city. Today, we're kicking off a two-episode exploration of Houston's iconic bayous, focusing on their essential ecological roles and the conservation efforts that sustain them. Let's dive in and uncover how these waterways have shaped and continue to shape life in Houston. I'm Sophia Soltes, a student researcher for Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. I would like to remind you that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. From several species of bats, all the way to alligators, yes, alligators, these waterways are home to an incredible range of wildlife, making them one of the most diverse regions in the city. To help us understand more, our first guest, Suzanne Simpson, who is a Houston-based ecologist and the author of the book Wild Houston, Explore the Amazing Nature in and Around the Bayou City, will share her insights on the ecology that makes these bayous iconic. Suzanne, it's good to have you back on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So first, why don't you tell us a bit about your experience with Houston wildlife and how this has shaped your knowledge of the bayous?
So I'm an ecologist with a background in wildlife conservation, and I grew up in the Kingwood area in Northeast Houston. A lot of times my interactions with the bayous were when I would, go from the suburbs into the city, and they kind of looked like concrete graveyards that were maybe a relic of a time gone by when the area was truly wild. But as I grew in my studies and my knowledge of what was living in the Houston area, the bayous are still very much alive and provide great habitat for a host of different species of wildlife, from birds to fish to, turtles, basically everything in between. There are so many wildlife species that depend on our bayous, and many of them still do have natural elements to them that really, really help provide habitat for wildlife species.
Yeah, and you briefly talk about the distinctive qualities of bayous, so I want to go back and talk about that. So, as we know, the bayous are home to such a diverse range of species, but before we dive into some of those, can you share a bit about what makes these waterways so unique compared to other natural areas in Houston?
Yeah, our bayous are sort of like Houston's arteries that are carrying that water eventually down into the Gulf of Mexico. And so they're very, there's a lot of nutrients that are coming downstream. This is our, circulatory system in a lot of ways that's carrying the lifeblood. And that's really important for wildlife that are looking for, food, shelter, all the basic necessities that wildlife need to persist. And so a lot of the habitats that we have along the bayous, which we call like riparian habitats, that's a land along waterways, that habitat is so rich in part and parcel because they are close to the bayous. So the bayous really are that life source that provides so much for wildlife species.
Now let's talk about some of the most iconic animals found in the bayous. On a previous episode of Gulf Streams, you've talked about the alligator snapping turtle, but this time we're going to pull back and talk about the bayous as a whole. So, on that note, can you share some of the species that thrive there and what makes them so well adapted to the environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So the alligator snapping turtle is kind of famous for their populations being recently discovered in like the last decade or so in the bayous. And that really made us pull back and say, okay, well, these are really important ecosystems. What else is in there? And absolutely, there's very long-lived gar and very large-bodied fish that are in there. You'll see, these news stories come up every now and then about somebody catching a huge, huge gar out of Buffalo Bayou, which is arguably our most urban waterway. We also, whenever there is a certain amount of fresh water that and salt water that are mixing in the right proportions, we can even get bull sharks that can go up into our bayou waterways, and then before they're going back down into what would be their more, natural habitat down in the bay in the Gulf of Mexico. So we also have a lot of species that live around the bayou. So maybe they're not aquatic living in the bayous, but species like the yellow-crowned night heron, that's a bird that loves hanging out in those riparian areas because of the abundant food sources. So they are going to be hunting during the day and the night. I mean, they just have a lot of options. And you'll even see some really cool species interplay between the yellow-crowned night heron, the black-crowned night heron, and the Wabridge bats that come out at sunset under Wabridge. You'll see herons predating on bats around the bayou. That's something that you really don't see in many other places. So that's a really cool interaction that we have in our bayous. And then, of course, there's our mammals like, coyotes, raccoons, possums. These are all going to be using the bayous as sort of like their super highways to connect to different habitats where they can thrive.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. And you do a great job addressing this already, but I want to hear a bit more about how to have the bayou's unique traits influence the type of species that call them home, and how might that change in different areas of the bayous?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on, how channelized that bayou is. When we have bayous that have still connected to their natural floodplains, that's where you're getting the most significant connection to wildlife habitat. So naturally our bayous were meant to sort of expand and contract with the amount of rainfall that we got. And they would be connected to our floodplains, which are areas that are supposed to flood intermittently whenever we have rainfall. And so those areas that are still naturally connected to our floodplains, those are particularly rich wildlife habitats because that water that's flooding that those areas, it's not just bringing water, it's also bringing a lot of nutrients that help to regenerate the soils of those ecosystems and small microinvertebrates, food sources for the building blocks of your food chain. So those are really, really rich, important, interconnected ecosystems right there. Connecting to our floodplains, that provides a lot of resources for wildlife.
Yeah, for sure. And as we know, the bayou is such a unique free flowing waterway that goes through a lot of different types of natural areas, urban areas, ecosystems. And we often hear about invasive species in ecosystems like the bayous. So I was wondering if you could share any notable examples and how they are impacting the native wildlife.
So in Houston, by and large, our native ecosystem is the coastal prairie. And coastal prairie are these really diverse grasslands, historically extended hundreds of thousands of miles. And now we have about 1% of that coastal prairie remaining intact. Now, those prairies were dependent upon disturbance, and sometimes that disturbance was, the bison coming in and grazing and then moving off of them, or it would be fires that were, naturally occurring in those areas. And over time, as we've settled, we've removed those disturbances from the ecosystem. And what comes in instead is oftentimes species that do not have natural checks and balances on their population and are not indigenous to this area. So an example is the tallow tree that comes from Asia, and it was brought by humans to this area. And Chinese tallow in its native range does have insect predators that can put some natural checks and balances on their population. But like I said, when those are removed, they are able to overpopulate and crowd out the diversity of our native ecosystems. And that's, important for the ecosystems that provide for a lot of like insects that are really dependent upon the different types of grasses and forbs, pollinators that are dependent upon the diversity of these ecosystems. So when we take that diversity away and it becomes a monoculture, its ecological value is greatly reduced. And that's what you see a lot with invasive species introductions.
In answering that question, you briefly mentioned what wildlife along the bayous and in the coastal prairies looked like before urban development came along. I'm wondering if you can share more about the interactions between the bayous and wildlife before the city of Houston was urbanized.
Before we had the built environment, bayous interacted with wildlife, but they also interacted with people, with our indigenous communities, the original inhabitants of our bayou areas. And it really was the source of life and the source of food, nutrients for both the wildlife and the people that lived along the bayou. And there are some really iconic species that we have lost over time that you could find on Buffalo Bayou, jaguars, for example, cougars, or also known as like pumas, mountain lions. They were along the bayous, black bears. These were all sort of megafauna species that would depend upon our bayous for life. And with urban development, they were hunted to extinction, lost their habitat. They're extirpated from this area. And so we don't have those apex species anymore, and that really does change the way that ecosystems interact whenever you take that top rung of the food chain off. But the bayous were home to the ivory-billed woodpecker, which was our largest species of woodpecker. That is another species that's gone extinct throughout the United States because of urban development and habitat loss and whatnot. So there was a lot of really, really cool species that are now, extirpated. For me, that makes me focus on wanting to protect the species that are there, like the alligator garlic, the alligator snapping turtle, the kingfishers, because I don't want to look back and say like, oh, this used to be a really cool place. I want it to be protected and conserved for future generations.
And you've mentioned a lot of species today, so I'm wondering if there are a couple of those species that you find particularly interesting, and if so, why?
Oh yes, I find I find many species very interesting. Let me try and think of a species that I haven't that I haven't featured earlier. My biggest fascination with wildlife is focused on reptiles and amphibians. And so as a result, that's where my mind always goes. Now, I understand that not everybody thinks of reptiles and amphibians as parts of the ecosystem that they want to interact with. But I will try to maybe try to convince people or at least give them appreciation for what's out there. So one species that's really well adapted to urban bayous is the diamondback water snake. So this is the diamondback water snake, not the diamondback rattlesnake. This is a non-venomous species of snake that is around aquatic areas. And let me tell you, if you ever like come upon a situation where a snake is trying to eat a fish that just seems way too big for it, like it's bitten off way more than it can chew, boy, diamondback water snakes, they have high confidence in their ability to digest a big meal. And they are really they're somewhat tolerant to urban influence, which means that they can still live in our bayou systems that are always going to have that element of human influence to them. But they're also very adaptable to different food sources. And so they're able to take advantage of different things that the bayou might provide, different aquatic species. They'll eat fish, they'll eat amphibians. They're kind of a generalist predator, but it is often this is also often confused with the cottonmouth just because it's a snake that's in water. But and it is our largest aquatic snake, largest body. It gets to the longest length. So anyway, I would just give a shout out to the diamondback water snake as a species that's really well adapted to urban waterways. And I don't know. I guess I just see a lot of personality in it trying to swallow these like really huge prey items that are going to take it like 2 weeks to digest. So good on it. Why not?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So, the bayous are often thought of in terms of their natural beauty, and as we've established, sometimes in terms of their distinctive critters like the diamondback water snake. But what ecological functions do they serve that might not be as visible?
Sure. It's bayous are so important for floodwater mitigation. And that is another reason why I think they really need to be elevated and celebrated. Bayous are what brought the commerce to Houston that really established Houston as an important city, and had people move here. Bayous can also be the reason why we get frustrated with flooding. But the fact of the matter is, like this city was founded on bayous, and so we have to really incorporate that to our understanding and our sense of place. So bayous are important for getting floodwaters, out of people's homes and letting the waters absorb into our natural ecosystems. And eventually that water is going to make its way down the watershed, eventually hitting, the ship channel, going into Galveston Bay and then going into the Gulf of Mexico. So bayous are provide a lot of important ecosystem services, particularly with respect to flood mitigation. And I think that is the main aspect of bayous that we're most intimately connected to as citizens of this area. Other than the tremendous wildlife resources, whenever we're experiencing the heavy rainfall that we're known for getting in Houston, it is our bayou systems that are collecting that rainfall and eventually bringing it downstream.
Yeah, and leading off of the important point that you made about the fact that Houston is founded on bayous, can you explain more about how the health of the bayous is tied to other parts of the city's environment, like wetlands or coastal regions?
So our wetlands that are by our bayous, we kind of call wetlands our nature's kidneys because they filter out the pollutants that are coming off of our built environment. They trap those pollutants in their root systems and under the soil, and they're able to denature those pollutants into less harmful components. So our wetlands that are adjacent to our bayous are really important for our quality of life. They're also just incredible nursery habitat for young species of wildlife. A lot of semi-aquatic and aquatic wildlife spend part of their life cycle in wetlands because they're a great nursery habitat. So important wildlife resources there, but also really important for humans. And whenever we remove wetlands from from their native place, that's oftentimes when we're running into issues with flooding. Whenever we've extended the built environment into wetland ecosystems, that water doesn't have a place to go anymore. And maybe there's a detention pond built, but certainly there is a severance of the native flow of how that water is going to move. And we've seen some of the ramifications of that in, the past decade here.
And this has kind of been a common theme throughout our whole talk today, but I wanted to devote a specific question to it. So, what challenges does the growth of urban development around the bayous pose to the wildlife that rely on these ecosystems?
There is already so much development around our bayous that we're starting to now see development in areas that actually have tributaries that feed into our bayous. So we're having even more pressure on these ecosystems, not just like the heart of where the bayous are, but even the tributaries that are feeding into those bayous further upstream. So, whenever that happens, whenever we're getting that much more runoff from the built environment, you are going to have adverse impacts to water quality, water quantity will change, and the ecosystem balance is going to change as a result. And there are some species that can adapt to that because they're just generalists and they are okay living in conditions that are dynamic. But there are some more, specialist species that are really potentially going to struggle as we continue to see this built environment change. And we have some species that can only live on the coastal prairie, for example, and can't live in, a built environment. A species that comes to mind is the crawfish frog. They're dependent upon like crawfish burrows in coastal prairie areas, and they're a specialist species. If you pave over their habitat or if you have a subdivision that moves in, very difficult for them to live in those areas. So it puts much more pressure on our wildlife resources, the more built environment that we have.
Yeah, well, Suzanne, thank you so much for bringing up all of these important points today, as well as the fascinating wildlife, as always. And thank you so much for coming on today.
It is always a blast. Thank you for having me.
With your newfound understanding of the rich ecology surrounding Houston's bayous, I'm sure that you're asking yourself, what is being done and what can be done to preserve these areas? Our final guest, Organizing and Cultural Strategies Manager at Bayou City Waterkeeper, Yudith Nieto, has come on today to answer some of these important questions. Hi, Yudith. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So, before we dive in, could you share a bit about your role with Bayou City Waterkeeper and what originally inspired your passion for waterway conservation?
Yeah, so my role is the Organizing and Cultural Strategies Manager. And historically, I've done more environmental justice organizing work, but integrate cultural strategies as part of my organizing work through language justice, accessibility justice, or disability justice, and incorporating, indigenous rooted frameworks or traditional knowledge, things that would further impact the organizing work and relationship building in our region. So what inspired me to do water justice or waterway conservation was through my own lineage, my own background of being a land-based immigrant person. My family's from San Luis Potosí, Mexico. And so from there, we've grown up with this sense of respect and stewardship for the land and water because we're so linked. Our survival is so linked. We are from the mid-zone desert region in Mexico, and so the cacti diversity there is so expansive, and we protect a lot of it because they're vulnerable, fragile ecosystems in the desert that support life and support our ways of life. And so that's what brought me to this work in that way.
And going back to what you said about having respect and stewardship of the land, can you try to help our listeners understand how the bayous fit into the larger water ecosystem in the Houston regions, as well as why they are so vital for our environment and community?
Sure, yeah. So I mean, we're called Bayou City for that reason, right? The bayous are the veins that pump our water throughout our region. It, travels throughout the city and travels down to Galveston Bay, which is our shared watershed. And a lot of people in the city don't know that we all have that in common. We have the same watershed. Galveston Bay and the Gulf of Mexico are where the bayous end up. The Houston bayous, such as Buffalo Bayou, Brays Bayou, White Oak Bayou, and all the tributaries that run through the city, but they have essential functions. It's a natural drainage system. It's essentially a nature-based solution for flood mitigation, for habitat for wildlife, for water filtration and recreational and cultural importance. Our city is so diverse, and so that also means that our biodiversity it mirrors who we are as people and how we relate to the waters around us. Some people hike or bike or kayak, bird watch, and even fish on the bayous. And historically, that's how the indigenous people of this region lived and thrived. Of course, before the industrialization of our area, it really shifted a lot of the ways, a lot of our relationship to the bayous. The bayous also offer climate resiliency. It helps to mitigate some of the flooding and helps to get the water out of the city, so it doesn't stay here too long and cause further damage and erosion of our lands and areas. And of course, our connection to the Galveston Bay and the Gulf of Mexico.
And on the theme of industrialization, what are some of the contemporary challenges that our bayous face today, whether from pollution, development, flooding, or other factors?
Yeah, so, these are key challenges. We are a hyper industrialized city. This is ground zero for the largest industrial complex in the country. And so in a sense, it becomes a sacrifice zone for our wildlife habitat, for our people of color who are most impacted by climate disasters. And then the quick urbanization and development of our areas of our city, it's reduced the bayou's natural capacity to absorb and manage the floodwaters. And then the creation of more impervious surfaces, creating like roads, buildings, highways. It keeps preventing the water from soaking into the ground, and so it causes more flooding in areas that are being developed. And pollution, of course. We have so many industries, we have a lot of stormwater runoff that often carry a lot of pollutants, heavy metals, chemicals, trash, and sewage. And of course, the issue with erosion, with so much water unable to move freely through the channelized bayous. And so if when the water isn't able to seep back into the ground, we have more and more erosion in the areas. And it affects people in so many different ways.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that elaboration. And considering all of these challenges, what do you see as the most pressing priorities for both the bayous and the larger ecosystem in our region?
Yeah, so I mean, biggest pressing challenges have to be, of course, the climate, change impacts, climate disasters that cause industrial disasters and the efforts to mitigate those impacts. There's several ways that we can do that and restore the health of our bayous or just stay consistent and intentional with the ways that we engage organizations that focus on this or community members, that they can learn more about it. Maybe engaging in projects like green stormwater infrastructure, nature-based solutions, as I mentioned before, projects like rain gardens, bioswales, permeable pavements, and other smart planning projects like that. Wetland restoration is also one of the things that we like to think about and focus on at the organization. Wetlands, there's a lot of misconception what wetlands are and what they function as, but these are buffers that help filter pollutants, they control flooding, and they improve wildlife habitat. And then they're also beautiful green spaces for people to spend time in, reconnect to nature and controlling or having better regulation around pollution, strengthening those regulations and on industrial discharges and urban runoff that can then increase contamination into the bayous. Not limited to sewage as well. I mean, last year we had a huge, I forget which hurricanes, we had so many storms, but one of the storms affected one of the water treatment plants, and we had a huge raw sewage runoff into the bayous. And so, a lot of waterways were impacted, but also a lot of neighborhoods. And this is a public health issue as well. And of course, continuing to continue the effort of public engagement, organizations that focus on the preservation of Buffalo Bayou and the other bayous and connecting to other partners, like the master naturalists, folks that educate more people to conserve and learn more about native prairies and grasses that could further help the flooding mitigation initiatives.
And we've already started this conversation, but I'd like to go a little more in depth. So, can you tell me a bit about the initiatives that Bayou City Waterkeeper is currently working on to address some of these issues, whether with the bayous specifically or with waterways or the watershed?
Yeah, so some of the initiatives that we work at Bayou City Waterkeeper to address some of these issues, there's so many root causes to the water challenges that the Houston communities are facing. And so we've narrowed down some water justice zones for us internally to be able to work within those regions. We do use 5 core strategies, and those are policy and research and advocacy. And this helps to support effective policies and regulations that can ensure urban development that wouldn't come at the cost of and the expense of the bayou health and community education, capacity building. And we would believe that community education is at the forefront of helping create more advocacy opportunities for folks to advocate to protect wetlands, to create more green stormwater infrastructure frameworks and things like that. And of course, encourage advocacy that promotes sustainable, environmentally friendly practices and rooted in nature-based solutions. We also focus on actions and campaigns. Some of the projects that we have, our community science team has created different maps. And so those are part of education pieces. We have a poo report that gets put out every quarter, and it illustrates sewer overflows across the city of Houston, and it includes the sewage releases on private and public property, but also helps people understand, like who these communities are, and have more like demographic indicators to help create a visual representation of who's dealing with all of these sewage overflows, right? We also have a Justice in the Sewers campaign. In 2018, our Bayou City Waterkeeper served the city of Houston with a notice of intent to sue for over more than 9,300 of these overflows, violating the Clean Water Act. So we use the Clean Water Act as a way to enforce the law and protecting water and waterways. And so that's one major way that we do that. And other actions and petitions and data toolkits and creating maps. Like I said, we've created the Water Justice Zone Mapper, which helps understand our water justice zones. We have a Wetland Watch Mapper, which helps people identify wetlands in the region and understand the benefits of the wetlands, and the roles that they play within them. And yeah, a lot of these strategies are implemented through the work that we do in organizing and community lawyering and policy work that we enforce here at the organization. And so it helps to create more collaborations with other stakeholders and community leaders and partners and so on.
And leading off the point you made about collaborations just now, are there any other organizations playing a complementary role in the work that your organization is doing?
Yeah, so we work with a few organizations. We work with the National Wildlife Federation, a team. We work with Turtle Island Restoration Network based in the Galveston Bay, and other organizations locally, like the Coalition with SEER, and you know other community-led organizations like the NAC, the Northeast Action Collective, and West Street Recovery, just to name those. And we actually, as an organization, launched a community research and action network that the acronyms are CRANE. In spirit of our Crane family members, our non-human members, and it's led by community partners and leaders that support and guiding us and connecting all these issues to create more cross-collaboration opportunities and support policy change and narrative change.
As we know, Houston is a rapidly growing city. I'm wondering if you believe that urban development and bayou conservation can coexist, and if so, what might that balance look like?
Yes, I mean, I do, in a sense, I do think that urban development and bayou conservation can definitely coexist. That balance is going to take some intentionality and some, deep thought about how to do this sustainably, how to do it transparently with community engagement at the forefront, of course, and especially with those most impacted by the loss of these environments. We need to start thinking too and looking back at our history as well in the city of Houston, and who have been left out of these conversations and who have been left out of these engagements and these initiatives, right? For example, like Indigenous peoples and uncovering Black histories and immigrant histories and the histories of the diverse population of the city of Houston, and then how development has happened over time in the city of Houston that has been more rooted in extractive practices of the region. We're heavy on oil and gas, and so how do we think smartly about some of this planning and development with the sense of investing in safer technologies, in new energy that's not going to be at the cost of those most impacted in the health of our bayous and waterways. And how we think about sewage as well, I think is a major one too, and it goes back to investing in safer technologies and technologies that are innovative, and using nature-based solutions as a way to mitigate some of the more overdeveloped, industrialized ways that we have implemented in the past. And I think conservation can have a lot to do with that. This also includes a cultural strategy to be able to restore the historic cultural erosion that we've seen and experienced in this region. And of course, that starts with engaging with indigenous communities and communities of color, and then reclaiming sacred sites or implementing more native plants, more native grasses and vegetation that support wildlife corridors and maintain the biodiversity of our area. And then, of course, wetland restoration and protection. And at the policy level, advocating for some of these laws, regulations, ordinances that would further support and creating initiatives to engage communities to also do their part, implementing rain gardens or, looking to more sustainable landscape practices using native plants instead of plants that are invasive and, non-native and that don't really do anything for the soil or don't do anything for the environment itself. Those are some things that come to mind, at least, finding a balance is going to be challenging, but we need to look at the negative impacts of developments right next to how we can enhance the ecological health and function of our bayous and restore those.
And as you've emphasized throughout our whole conversation today, public awareness and community action are crucial for conservation. So now I'm wondering, what role does community involvement play in protecting the bayous, and how can everyday Houstonians contribute?
Yeah, I mean, again, like educating ourselves, each other, educating the next generation on reconnecting to nature and finding the solutions in nature. And figuring out ways to balance that economic development with environmental protection and the cost, right? Because all of these things will come at a cost. And so thinking about what types of investments and, projects that could further support green stormwater infrastructure or flood mitigation support and this yeah, I mean, I guess rethinking the cost versus like money and profit and the health, the public health of the people and the health of our the ecological benefits of our region and the green spaces and how we maintain those. And it's going to take a lot of thought, a lot of thinking, and engaging community, and starts at the education piece as well, like connecting people to what it means to foster Bayou stewardship and how do we like teach residents about the importance of that and being able to offer support through either community cleanups and monitoring and raising public awareness about, what type of issues we're seeing around. And so our organization, like the Wetland Watch work that we do is crucial to that because that's a way for communities to act as water keepers as well and raise awareness about what they're seeing in their own bayous, in their own neighborhoods, and reporting that, offering insight to where some of the things are happening. We get calls from community members all the time that they see a Coca-Cola truck dumping, some black sludge or black type of liquid into a waterway, and then the fish dying the next day, or like, the pH balance in the water completely changing, and like all kinds of really weird things that happen, but people don't know that they can report these things, to the TCEQ, to the EPA, and advocating for those systems, those agencies to do more, right? To engage with communities more and educate people on their own rights to raise this awareness is also it's crucial.
Finally, for those listening who want to take action, what are some practical steps that they can take to support bio and watershed conservation in Houston?
Um, well, I mean, folks can join our newsletter to stay informed. They can join our socials to stay up to date to the events that we have coming up. We host a series of wetland walks, which help people come and learn about the wetlands in their areas and the parks that have wetlands as flood mitigation projects. And so, we encourage people to join us for those. We also just launched our Artist in Residence program, which I'm leading. And so folks, artists in the local area want to apply. We will be taking applications up until February, the second week of February, something like that. And yeah, we hope to work with more folks that believe in the work of Bayou City Waterkeepers and are stewards of their own areas and their own nature around.
Yeah, well, Yudith, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about all of the fascinating work that you do.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Of course. So that is all for today's talk about bayous, where our speakers discuss the ecological significance and conservation efforts surrounding Houston's bayous. Hopefully, each of you was able to gain valuable insight, whether it be about a critter that you had no idea frequented the bayous or the importance of these waterways in flood mitigation. But don't worry, our journey through Houston's bayous isn't over yet. Next time, we'll take a look at the bayous through the photography of Jeff Winningham in his book A Long Forgotten River. We'll share some of the stories behind his photographs and the deeper connections with the bayous he discovered through his work. Thanks for tuning in to learn about the bayous, and make sure to listen next week if you're eager to learn more. Now, we're going to hear from Jadyn Bray-Boyce, a fellow student researcher, about how we can turn to nature for clarity.
Imagine this. You're walking along a path in the woods with towering pine trees surrounding you, a soft breeze, and the light shimmering down through the tree branches. As you make your way down the trail, you find yourself by a dock, leading into an expansive body of shimmering blue water. Now, I take it this is far more relaxing than the image of sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic on the Katy Freeway. So, for many in need of a way to de-stress, why aren't we turning to nature? Even if you can't escape the city for hours, grounding yourself in nature, whether by strolling through a park or enjoying your own backyard, can make a world of difference. Nature is just one way that you can improve your overall physical and mental health. This notion of turning to nature for health and clarity has been studied scientifically. For instance, the British Heart Health Association published an article stating that just a 20-minute stroll through nature could significantly reduce your levels of cortisol, also known as the stress hormone. In an age when so much of our time is spent on Zoom calls, playing video games, or buried in spreadsheets, it's more important than ever to reconnect with nature for the sake of our physical and mental well-being. Being in nature can be beneficial for numerous reasons. To start, it reduces stress levels. It can improve cognitive function and enhance your focus, as well as improve your mood and lead to more positive emotions, all of which are essential for a healthy and balanced life. As for stress reduction, spending just a little time in nature every day can drastically reduce stress levels because of the concept of biophilia. This is the idea that humans have an innate tendency to seek connections with nature. Biophilia suggests that being surrounded by natural elements like trees, water, and fresh air can help regulate our emotions and create a sense of calm. A journal published by the National Library of Medicine shows that biophilia could actually be an evolutionary adaptation, leading to us clinging to more natural elements being exposed in homes, schools, and corporate buildings. The article suggests that there is a deep connection between biophilia and people overcoming feelings of isolation and separation. As for improving your focus and cognitive function, nature does a wonderful job of calming and revitalizing the mind. In fact, there's actually a theory called the intention restoration theory, created by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, who believe that natural elements engage the brain's involuntary attention, allowing the directed attention system, which is responsible for focus and concentration, to rest and recover. Therefore, later allowing the brain to have more energy and ultimately improves one's focus. Additionally, a research study titled The Cognitive Benefits of Interacting with Nature showcases that in many circumstances, nature can actually restore the mind and improve cognitive function, particularly when the attention restoration theory, or ART, is involved. Ultimately, this makes nature an effective remedy to mental fatigue, improving focus, problem-solving skills, and overall cognitive function. So for those of you overwhelmed by the constant demands of work or just life in general, consider simply stepping outside and taking a brisk walk in the park for clarity and rest. If you haven't ever turned to nature for therapy, here are a few accessible ways to get started. Starting off quite simple, you could consider tending to a few houseplants to bring life into your space. You could also consider starting a garden in your backyard or on your terrace if space permits. If you can couple that with a few outdoor walks per week, you may be able to see great improvements in not only your mental, but physical health as well. If you're not one for walks, the act of meditating in an outdoor space can be quite beneficial as well. Overall, the central theme is that to test if this theory works for you, you must spend some time outdoors. So now, if you consider yourself to be a rather adventurous person and you're looking for a way to blow off some steam, get a workout in, or even just try something new, try one of these outdoor activities like hiking, rock climbing, biking, or kayaking. Not only will you try something new, but you may also gain the added benefits of stress relief. According to Promise Care, as these activities will release endorphins, ultimately boosting your mood. However, if all of these seem to be too much to start with baby steps. Perhaps take your lunch break outside or study break and set achievable goals for yourself. Though finding green spaces or mobility issues may pose as a challenge for some people, you can utilize the concept of micronature, essentially taking advantage of a local community garden or terrace green space to gain the same nature experiences. In a world filled with deadlines, digital screens, and endless to-do lists, reconnecting with nature may be one of the simplest and most effective ways to restore balance in our lives. Whether it's through a mindful walk in the park, tending to houseplants, or embracing more adventurous activities like hiking or kayaking, the benefits of immersing yourself in nature are undeniable. From reducing stress and improving focus to boosting your mood and fostering emotional well-being, nature offers a wealth of opportunity to heal and rejuvenate both body and mind. Even small steps, like taking your lunch break outdoors or sitting on your balcony surrounded by greenery, can make a meaningful difference. The key is to start where you are, with what you have, and incorporate nature into your daily routine in ways that feel accessible and enjoyable. Whether you're seeking stress relief, enhanced cognitive clarity, or a greater sense of happiness, nature has something to offer for everyone. So now I'll leave you with the wise words of John Muir to hopefully convince you to spend more time in nature. It goes as follows. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks.
Next up, Jadyn will tell you about some ways to get involved with environmental initiatives in the Houston area this week.
Hey y'all, if one of your New Year's resolutions is to give back to the community, I've got a couple of suggestions to help get you started in the next few weeks. Whether you're looking for an ongoing commitment or a one-time opportunity, there's something here for everyone who wants to make a difference for the planet right here in Houston. If you prefer a low-commitment project that allows you to see the impact of your efforts over time, consider volunteering at the Houston Botanical Garden. They're currently looking for enthusiastic volunteers who can give a minimum of 1 day per month to assist the horticulture staff with hands-on gardening and maintenance tasks. You'll get to help with projects like neighborhood beautification, wildflower seeding, and bed maintenance, among others. It's a great way to learn about the plants, meet like-minded individuals, and help keep Houston beautiful. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy, then head on over to hbg.org/support/volunteer/ to fill out an application today. For those of you looking for a one-time volunteering opportunity, mark your calendars for Friday, February 7th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. at Brewster Park. Volunteers will be gathering to plant trees, which is one of the best ways we can give back to the environment. Tree planting not only improves air quality and provides shade, but also makes our community greener and more vibrant. No prior experience is necessary, just bring your enthusiasm. To reserve your spot, visit houstonwilderness.org, and they'll provide updates on the location and any changes to the date or time, so be sure to check their website for details. I hope that one or both of these opportunities inspires you to get out there and give back to Houston's natural spaces. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and happy volunteering.
If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like to be featured on Gulf Streams, please leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana. Auto engineer Rico Henriquez Fluviatoro. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Jadyn Bray-Boyce, Nauman Rent Store, and finally me, Sophia Soltes. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.